Hello, and welcome to 1840, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're exploring intergenerational divergence. Thank you so much to the sponsor of today's episode, our friend Evan Goldenberg, and thank you again to the sponsor of this entire series, our second look at intergenerational divergence. A big thank you to our friend Danny Turkel. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, that's 18forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, and recommended readings. One of my big hesitations before we began this series of intergenerational divergence, which again, not the best name, it's definitely a mouthful, but we began it last year, and as those who have been listening since then, we interviewed the Grama family, the Frisch family, and the Penner family, and each of those families had incredibly noticeable, obvious divergences, whether they were denominational differences, whether they were differences of observance, whether they were differences in sexual orientation, building family, and that future. The differences were quite obvious and quite clear. And I was definitely concerned that in many ways I thought that the starkness of these examples could actually be a distraction. If the only thing that we're willing to talk about is building that parent-child relationship when it's so obvious how different it is, that the life is so different, it can sometimes obscure the everyday differences that oftentimes slowly erode or slowly build friction within the structure of a family. In many ways, my own family is an example of the latter. Thank God, my parents are unbelievable people and they were able to raise 5, fairly similar children. That's to, if you have a bird's eye view and you look from a distance, we are all fairly similar. When you look in closer, our lives are a little bit different. Some of us are a little bit more religious, some of us are a little bit less religious. Some of us raise our kids in one community, some in the other community. And, when you talk about it from the outside, it's like, yeah, that's not a struggle, that's life, that's what everybody's dealing with. But inside of any family, undoubtedly, as any family knows, this is really where the tug of war, those imperceptible slights can start to build some sense of factionalism even within a family. And my family is certainly no different. And I'm sure for nearly all of our listeners, the family structure that you grew up in, even if it didn't have a stark example of intergenerational divergence that could headline a podcast, so to speak, that had this headliner story of, wow, child goes to the mirror, mom is a Reform rabbi, there are smaller types of differences that I think still merit discussing and can still in many ways be a challenge in finding that cohesion, that sense of love, that sense of trust, that sense of confidence between a parent and a child. The term that's often thrown around that I think is appropriate over here is the one that was originated by Ernest Crawley but was really popularized by Sigmund Freud, and that's the narcissism of small differences. The notion that when we are in places that are more or less similar, you live in a Jewish community, you live in Teaneck, I live in Bergenfield, you live in LA, you live in the Valley, or whatever it is, that second example wasn't great. But very often, the more we are similar, the more our differences become highlighted. And that is particularly true in the context of a family. The fact that we are all part of this family, and this is what Beshefkins do, this is what Moskowitzes do, this is what the Smiths do, this is what the Weinbergers do, this is whatever family does. Every family has its culture, and because there is that culture within the family, when there are these smaller differences, they tend to be magnified and highlighted. And I think it is healthy and helpful to talk about how we navigate those smaller differences, even within the backdrop of unity. And in many ways, that's the conversation that we are having today. And it is really an absolute privilege to be speaking with Rav Moshe Weinberger and his son, Asher, or as I believe as he is known, Ushi, in the family. This is really the third time that we're having Rav Moshe Weinberger on. We did an interview a while back when we did our series on mysticism. He had a brief cameo in our story before Yom Noraim, the high holidays last year, where we told the story of the Yablana Rebbe. This is a different story, but in many ways, it's the same continuity, it's the same theme that underlies really my relationship with Rav Moshe Weinberger and what has always stood out at the center for me and how I relate to him. I think I mentioned this story the first time that I interviewed with him, but I want to repeat it in a little bit of a different context. As many of you may or may not know, I've mentioned this 101 times, I dated for a very, very long time. And I began dating, I was in the yeshiva world. I was living in yeshiva in Baltimore, in Ner Yisrael. I was, going out. I was wearing a hat and a jacket and the whole thing. And by the time that I got married, the way I looked, the type of girls that I was dating was very, very different than the girls that I began dating. And I remember at some point in that transition, Rav Moshe Weinberger called me up, and he wanted to mention an idea for me to maybe consider taking somebody out on a date. And he was describing this person to me, and he was so effusive of how holy and righteous. He was talking about her Yirah Shamayim, her awe, her heavenly awe, of how serious of a person this was. And I was so embarrassed because I wasn't in that place that I once was, that I began in yeshiva. And I remember telling him over the phone, I said, Rebbe, I'm not there anymore. That's not who I am. That's not what I'm looking for. And I'm sorry, I don't know if this works. And that self-admission was really painful to realize and to talk about, that you're not in the place, you're not in the trajectory that you once imagined for yourself. But I will always remember his response. And his response was, Ein chassidish ke chassidish rishona. Which I'll translate, Ein chassidish ke chassidish rishona, means there is no chassidus, there is no relationship like that initial steps that you have, the passion, the fervor, the idealism that you have in that very beginning, that always evolves into something else. Beginnings do not necessarily follow a sequential path to the middle and ultimately to the end. It's an idea that I believe first appears in the Rokeach, where the language that the Rokeach uses, the figure from early Chassidic Ashkenaz, you could look at the life of the Rokeach, but the language the Rokeach uses is Ein Chozek ke chassidus b'tchilaso. Those initial steps don't always bear out in the way the rest of your life is going to look and the way the rest of your life is going to unfold. But it always stuck with me because buried underneath the statement of Ein Chassidus ke Chassidus Rishona, that your initiation into that world of passion, of commitment, of observance is not going to necessarily be the same as what evolves later, is also the idea that there is such a thing as a chassidus shniya, a second chassidus, a third chassidus, a fourth chassidus. That the entry point that we have in forming our religious identities, our personal identities, may have a specialness, a passion, something that makes it different, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a chassidus. And of course I don't mean chassidus in the literal sense of being a part of a Hasidic community. I am not a part of a Hasidic community, but it means being able to cultivate that sense of passion that you had in the beginning. It doesn't mean that just because your initial passion is not going to be the same in that second and third and fourth stages of your life, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be a chassid in that purest sense, that sense of commitment and passion at all. There is a notion of evolving over the course of your life. There is a notion of changing. And I believe that this conversation between Rav Moshe Weinberger and his son Ushi is a model of that difference between Chassidus Rishona, that initial entry point to Chassidus, and Chassidus Shniya, and a second entry point, and a second doorway, and a third, and a fourth. And I mean that on two levels. Firstly, this conversation is about the evolution of a father, about how Rav Moshe Weinberger, and as he discusses in our conversation, began as a parent and now sees himself as the parent to an adult. But I think in many ways it's a beautiful story of Ushi. Now, I know Ushi for many, many years. We first met, we were doing outreach together in downtown Manhattan. I remember I was first introduced to him, and like any time you're introduced to somebody who comes from a notable family, it began with a whisper from the person who was making the introduction, you should know who his father is. And I'm always sensitive to that because I grew up also. My father isn't a world-renowned educator. He's not a world-renowned rabbi, but he was also very well known in the community. He was an oncologist. And I overheard such whispers, you should know your father, this and that. And I always feel an instinctive pain when I hear that whisper, because even if it's not literally overheard, it's certainly subsumed in your identity growing up, knowing the home that you grow up in. But I really became close with Asher, with Ushi, later on when we worked together on a magazine initiative. When I was working for Mashpia magazine, we were doing an initiative about entrepreneurship. And it always stuck with me that when we were rolling out the initial concept for what later became, I think it's called 2.0, which is an insert in Mashpia magazine, during our first meeting, he began by saying, this is all chassidus. What we are trying to do is trying to bring spirituality and commitment and passion and allowing people to see it in their entrepreneurial initiatives, to be able to see it in their professional lives. We're trying to build a doorway for people to see that underlying spirituality that can animate their professional lives. And I remember that initial conversation, which stuck with me to this very day, was a model in my mind of what a chassidish shniya can look like. Not that initiation into the world of passion and commitment, but maybe that reignition, that re-entry, that beginning again, with the knowledge that we need more than one doorways. We can't just have a doorway. We can't just have a signpost at an entry point for that initiation. We need to build on-ramps even later on in life. And that's why it is such a privilege and pleasure to introduce this conversation, because it is about that evolving relationship between a parent and a child, navigating real differences, but small differences, because small differences can be real differences. And we shouldn't just hand wave and say, oh, okay, no, they're fine, they're the same. I think if we look at our own lives and our own relationships and see which ones get under our skin, we will realize that small differences can be real differences, and our ability to navigate them, to talk about them, to have real conversations, even when the impetus might be fairly small, can be healthy in order to build strong relationships, evolving relationships, and relationships that have multiple entry points, no matter what point of a person's life they are. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our conversation with Rav Moshe Weinberger and his son, Asher Weinberger. So I can't thank you both enough. It's one of the deepest privileges to talk to both of you, who we've never been in the same room together, I don't think, and we both have kind of our separate relationships. But I know you both. I've been influenced by you both in different ways. And what we're trying to explore is how families kind of negotiate and deal with difference. And I guess I wanted to begin this conversation with a picture that Asher sent me. He sent me a picture of him in Simcha Day Camp, which I'm also an alumnus of. I love Simcha Day Camp. And in the picture, you see it's a young Asher, probably around 7 years old. He has langa peyos. He has, the side locks down around to shoulder length. He looks very, very sweet. And the Asher I know now is also very much connected to Yiddishkeit and Jewish life, but at the same time, it doesn't have peyos down to his shoulder, which we could explore, and took a little bit of a different route. And I'm wondering if we could begin with the question of what was the original plan, so to speak. You have a young child, and you're always balancing between the ideals and the dreams of what the child can become and the reality of the world and the path that we take. I'm wondering if each of you could kind of explain, what did you feel the original plan was?
Well, should I begin? I guess the plan was originally coming from me. Lucy entered in a couple of years into the game. The original plan was Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz. But somewhere further along, I think that my original plan was that the true chassid, the chassidish yid that I wanted to become myself, that I was dreaming of becoming myself from the time that I was around 13, 14, and I put on my cousin's strimal to see how it looked. So instead of actually working as hard as I should have to become that true chassid and Oved Hashem, I think that unconsciously I decided that my son would become that person. I think that was my original plan. Not with the girls. The girls, I would leave them be. But with my one boy, with my one son, that was the original plan. Of course, a Yirei Shemayim and a person that sits and learns Torah and so on. But according to the model that I had envisioned for myself, but I guess on a deeper level that I felt that I had perhaps, forfeited or given up because of the life that I was living.
Asher, does that resonate with you? How did you feel when you were first growing up? Like, did you feel that there were expectations, so to speak, of what you would be moving into and becoming?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely felt there were expectations. And I think that from my perspective, the confusing part was just expectations meeting my reality, because the community in which I grew up in wasn't necessarily Borough Park, Williamsburg. However, Far Rockaway back in those days was certainly a little bit more colorful. So it wasn't unusual for me to, for example, have long peyos or to have a different set of philosophies. It wasn't so unusual back then. I think where it really started to become more of a stark contrast for me was when I went out into summer camp, and then eventually to high school and more mainstream, yeshivas, where all of a sudden I found out that I wasn't exactly, so typical. So it wasn't so much a point of conflict for me earlier on. But I think it's a really interesting topic. And I think that I did sense early on that there was maybe some sort of desire to capture something that was, which, Dad, is it okay if I call you the OG flip out?
What is OG?
OG means meaning the
original gangster.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I was one of the originals. Yeah.
Right, the original flip out, right? So I think that has sort of developed into its own culture, right? And I think what's really changing is that now it's less about, well, put it this way. Back then, I think there was more of this desire for not just for you, Dad, but for a lot of people to flip out, to become something other, right? To try to either capture something that was lost, particularly post-Holocaust. You can imagine all the trauma there, to try to capture something. But I think now where it's really come full circle, where it's more about flipping in than flipping out. And I think what's interesting is that ultimately I resisted that path, right? At least the external social components of it. But what's really ended up happening, I think, coming full circle, is that maybe it was the right move, because I don't think we find anymore that the true legacy of the Baal Shem Tov, if you will, is found anymore in mainstream, for lack of a better term, Chassidus, right? So what's really happening now is it's becoming its own subculture, right? And I'm not saying that I sensed that at that point in my life, but I think that it's become true for me today.
So I actually want to go step by step, and maybe the next step, you come and you have these ideals. You're growing up in a home where, as your father explained, to kind of raise you in the way that maybe he wasn't raised, or create a world that he wishes he grew up in. When did each of you notice, and maybe you could speak on this first, Asher, because you already alluded to it, that original trajectory of kind of emerging in this almost insular world that didn't really exist on the ground, Simcha Day Camp. I went to Simcha Day Camp, we probably overlapped at Simcha Day Camp. I don't know if we were in the same bunk. My original writing, just as a PS, was in the News and Schmooze, which was the newspaper of Simcha Day Camp. It was the first time I ever wrote. But I'm curious when each of you noticed that original trajectory of kind of recapturing that lost world of chassidish chinuch in Far Rockaway would have to be modified.
I didn't know that you were at Simcha Day Camp too. I guess that's because you were busy writing things. I was playing ball. We probably didn't interact too much. Yeah, but I think for me, the key inflection point was probably the search for a high school. Because again, growing up in the community, very much in my home, we lived in Woodmere. I didn't have too many friends from the yeshiva world in my community.
Because where did you go to elementary school? You went to Siach Yitzchak?
Siach Yitzchak, yeah.
Sure.
And in Siach Yitzchak was very much, it was totally, I was totally normal there. Right? This was very often the children of Bali Tshuva from the world of Shlomo Freifeld, often trickling down from Shlomo Kalbach. It was very, very flexible and didn't feel at all like any conflict to me. Again, where it began was in summer camp. I started going to camps. I don't want to mention which ones, and there started to be some friction there. Really strange things that occurred there. Like I remember in one summer camp, there was this kid who had a picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and would intentionally, just to try to get me upset. I don't know why he thought this would upset me per se, but well, it did. He would stomp on the picture, or spit on it, things like that, kind of absurd things, because they'd never seen a kid with long peyos before, at least not in the same bunk as them, right? So started to have some conflict there, which ended up in a couple of fistfights and my departing on less than mutual terms from different camps. But really where it began was the process of looking for high school. What's the next phase? And it was wide open. So we were looking at different yeshivas, and I think at the time one of the leading contenders, at least Dad, from your perspective, was the yeshiva of Stalin. And we went down there, I remember, for hair, and I think the hair went pretty well.
Was that a Yiddish-speaking yeshiva?
I think one of the selling points you made, Dad, was that I think that they speak English a lot of the time. So yeah, Stalin is somewhat of they're Litvish chassidish and they're more Americanized, and that was why the thinking, I think, it made more sense, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember going down there and asking during the walkthrough, asking the Manala Rosh Yeshiva, I asked him where the basketball court was, and he said something along the lines of the boys play sometimes handball on the side of the building, and I was like, uh-oh. But if I recall correctly, Dad, tell me if my memory is completely not serving me, or if I fabricated this, but I remember on the drive home from Brooklyn, we were talking about this, and I think we pulled over into maybe Costco parking lot over there on Rockaway.
Sure.
And if I recall correctly, what I said was I felt I needed to just sort of say where I stood on this issue, and I just felt like after going there and seeing it for myself, and I had gone to other yeshivas on the as well too, and I just felt that this wasn't the right fit for me. And I said, I think along the lines of something like, I may have long peyos, I may look a certain way, but that's not really, at least socially, it's not really the world that I live in, and I don't feel comfortable over there. It's not really the path that I want for myself. I wasn't talking about chassidus, what I really know. I mean, I knew we learned a lot together, but it wasn't something that I felt connected to culturally at all. And I felt very foreign when I was there, didn't feel like the right place for me. So I believe the response, I remember when I said this, I think the response was like, it wasn't easy to hear, I'm sure. Like, I don't want to be, that chassid, at least the archetype that you had sort of maybe imagined. But I think the response was something like, okay, if you're not going to be a chassid, then next stop we're going is to Riverdale. Like, then we're going to be big lit fox. Like, we got to be amazing at whatever we do. So if we're not going to be like hardcore Hasidim, we're going to be amazing lit fox. So, but anyways, we ended up in Shara Torah, which was, I think, the right place for me at the time. Whatever, that's the beginning of a longer trajectory. But I think that was the point where it became clear to me that, it was kind of binary.
So I'm curious, Rebbe, when you think back at that and you think of when you noticed that the original trajectory of kind of recapturing that world would have to be modified, does your mind go to the same point in time, picking high schools for a child and seeing what fits, or did your mind go someplace else?
1,000%. I knew that Ushi was going to say the trip to Stalin, and that was the watershed moment in that picture that I had created and envisioned. That was unquestionably the time. Ushi, Baruch Hashem, is brilliant at learning. He was the faher in Stalin. They accepted him on the spot. He's tremendous in learning. And I was so excited because I thought, I'm such a smart guy. Like if I would have taken him to Bobov or to Sabna, there wouldn't have been a chance. But here I took him to like this modern, more of a modern, Americanized chassidish place. Okay, it's in Borough Park, but I wanted to show them there's some guys walking around there, that they talk English to each other. And here I thought that this would be the perfect integration of Far Rockaway and Ungvar and Munkac, where my parents come from, that somehow they would merge on 16th Avenue. It was a delusion, of course, on my part. I wouldn't just say in retrospect. I think probably, half hour later, I realized it was a delusion. But there was no question that trip back home, Ushi knows that I was crushed by that. I was crushed by that revelation. No fault of his, because he's absolutely right. I did not raise him in that culture. It wasn't a matter of the learning. Ushi loved learning. That wasn't the issue. And he loves Yiddishkeit. He always loved Yiddishkeit. And the peyos that he cut off at some point, he has much longer peyos now inside of him, much longer peyos than ever. But culturally, I was so off with that. I was so off. And Ushi knows that one of the, I don't know if Ushi ever read, or if David, if you're familiar with it, there's a famous poem called Miniverchivi. It's about a person. My wife always calls me like Miniverchivi when I'm having one of those trips back, in Jewish history. Like you're 1840, I think that's what we are, 1840.
1840, yeah.
1840, which was that time, 1840. So my wife knows that if I could pick a time to go back, that I would go back to 1840. I've been living in the 20th and 21st century, but in my mind and in my heart, I'm pure 1840. I'm Miniverchivi. And when we took that trip home, and Ushi honestly told me, Dad, I don't think this is for me, then it was very hard for me to process what happened to, like, how could this be? After all, your grandparents were in the Holocaust. And what are we here for if not to get back to 1840? We're not moving forward. We're moving to the past. Why would you want something different? And it was very hard for me to understand and to accept this, which was it's so obvious that culturally I was doing violence to my son. It wasn't shaykh, to pick him up and to put him into Borough Park in that world, as beautiful as it was and as it is. And Ushi knows that there's something very beautiful about it. And even back then he knew it was something beautiful. It's just not us. And it's not me either. It's not really me. As I said at the very beginning, it's what I wanted to be, but I couldn't recreate myself because I went to YHSQ, I went to YCQ, and I play ball and I listened to all the Goyish music and I was part of that world. So now I'm a flip out. We didn't call it flip out back then. We just, whatever we did. But my son, my only son, he's going to be the one that's going to go back to 1840. He's going to start from 1840. I couldn't anymore because I got in that time warp of the 1960s and the 70s. So I was messed up by Simon and Garfunkel. I was just messed up by Woodstock, by the whole thing. I mean, I didn't do any drugs or anything like that ever. Well, Hashem, I was always clean.
Not yet.
That was my world. But my son, I'm going to send back to 1840. That was the project. And that trip back from Stalin, what Ushi was talking about, that's when it became clear to me that I was delusional.
So I want to get a little bit to the question of almost the surprise of being surprised. It's something strange to grow up in a house of a world-renowned educator and like you're in this home, you're both living in this home, and it's surprising that you were so surprised and how that shifted. But before we get to that, I want to kind of, because you mentioned it, Ushi, who I know very well, and I know about his inner peyos quite well, but I want to talk about that moment, because I was just talking to a friend of mine, Chabad. He's not a shliach, but he's a Rav of a shul, very close to. I go there every year, Yom Narayim, and he raised his kids, not to shave, and a lot of his kids, Taka, began to shave, and I was talking to him about how he reacted to that. And I'm curious if you could come to the moment and talk a little bit about the moment when Asher, who grew the long peyos, which represents something. There's something external and tangible and real about that. About the moment when you decided to cut them, to no longer have, you have peyos obviously, but not langa chassidish peyos. The moment that you decided to cut them, how old were you? Why did you decide at that point? And how did your father, Rebbe, how did you react to that?
Okay, so first, I kind of want to respond to that, what you had said before, your experience of it on the other side, and it will sort of segue into the peyos question. I look back sometimes and I wonder, was I assertive enough or early enough? And what I think about it, the way I think about it now is that I was trying to be very gentle, because I had this sense that this was very meaningful and this was very important. And I also had this sense that I can't really understand how important this is to my father, because I'm one generation removed from that. I didn't grow up hearing my parents screaming in their sleep, right? And Dad, remember we were talking this the other day about how it just found out, like scientifically speaking, how a woman carries all the eggs she'll ever produce from the time she's born, right? And in a way, children of Holocaust survivors actually were in the camps, right? And I can't understand what that can do to a person. I can't understand how that alters our psyche and our vision for ourselves and for the future, and any entanglements and transgenerational trauma, etc. So it's something that I intuited, like this is something you have to handle carefully, because this is actually something you can't understand, never will be able to understand. So I tried to be as gentle, and sometimes maybe that was a disservice to myself, not asserting or communicating clearly about where I stood on things and what I was comfortable with. But yeah, that's just a process of growing up and maturing. So the same thing really was with the peyos. It wasn't like there was this one moment where I said, okay, I'm going to cut them off. It wasn't like that. It was kind of a very gradual process. And I think that really speaks to the core of what the experience is like, what my experience is like, and probably what the experience is like for other people growing up in a similar type of dynamic with a parent who is somewhat, we'll call it larger than life, or extremely charismatic dynamic, or famous for lack of better terms, right? For most people, the process of life is adding on layers. It's growing your peyos longer and incrementally, right? It's like discovering things that your parents provide you with a great platform, and from there you just add your unique, the things you want to add to your life, right? Whether it's perspectives, it's ideologies, it's practice, whatever it is. But for me, and for people like me, I'd say the process is absolutely 180 degrees in reverse. It's the process of removing layers, right? You're given these big ideas. You're the child of people who've already figured it out, more or less, right? And so you grow up around all these big ideas that are not yet integrated per se, right? They feel right, they sound right, but they're not necessarily yours. You don't own them. So you might have long peyos, but they're not necessarily ones that you grew, right? So the process of maturing and growing for someone in my circumstance is really the opposite. It's the removal of layers, taking off each layer at some point in your life, holding up to the light, looking at it and saying, is this mine? Do I want this? If so, I'll take it back. If not, I'll discard it. Right. So it's a reverse process of growth. It's confusing. And it's not like, I'm not advocating that we need to have special institutions for privileged people like myself. Like, I don't think it's going to be I can't go door to door collecting. Hey, I'm looking to raise money for an institution for privileged sons of, rabbis and CEOs. No one's going to donate to that cause. But it's definitely a very different experience. It's the removal of layers, and it's gradual. And to what you're saying, it's like the irony of it is that it actually worked out. And I'm wondering if it worked the other way, what would have happened? Had I gone to a mainstream institution, maybe I'd be stuck in the mainstream, and the inner peyos never would have grown to where they are today, right? So I think, of course, everything always works out. It's all a process of evolution, but spiritual evolution. But it's just ironic that I think it actually worked out exactly the way it was supposed to.
Before your father responds, I'm just curious, this is the technical question, just so I have like a timeline in my own head.
Sure.
How old were you when you cut off your peyos? I'm just curious.
It started in ninth grade when I went to high school.
Oh, it was literally gradual. They got like a little bit shorter.
Yeah. Then behind the ear, then eventually,
Oh, gotcha.
and to this day, every time I take a haircut, I am still conscious of it. It's something that it's still an active process for me until I decide not to, if I decide not to. And it was meaningful to me. It wasn't just like a cavalier kind of, hey, on and off the next day. It was something that I took seriously. And also, again, trying to be sensitive to it and trying to do something gradually. I don't want to shock anyone, I think.
Come down one morning, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to do that, but I do remember the sound you made when you found my shaver for the first time. That was funny.
What was that sound, Asher, in your memory?
Like what's this? There's never been, a shaver has never crossed the threshold.
It never crossed the threshold.
Right, and
Gotcha.
Honestly, the funny thing is I don't shave today either. But well, I also don't have a long beard.
Okay, so before you respond, I want to kind of add in something in his question because it reminded me of the person who you brought me towards, which is Reb Tzadok, who I love to quote. And Reb Tzadok, when he opens up his first sefer of Chassidus, talks about the process of growth needs to begin very, very quickly. Reishis Knesses Ha'adam Tzarich Lios B'chipazon, which is couched in the Pesach story. That the initial leaving was very hurried and quick and just jumping a lot of steps, and then afterwards to go slowly. And I'm curious, when you reflect back, kind of the question that Asher asked, do you look at this as maybe it was necessary? Maybe we did have it all right, and you need to kind of skip maybe a lot of steps and have a little bit of a dissonance between where you are and the aspirational where you want to be, and it would be totally different, and all of the decisions and the surprises were absolutely necessary? Or do you look back at it and say maybe we needed a little bit more la'at, a little bit more of that gradualness? And I'm wondering if you could couch your response in the way you reacted when the physical appearance, particularly the peyos — this isn't a conversation about yes peyos, no peyos. If that's what you're hearing to our listeners, you're missing the whole boat. But couching that in your reaction, the initial reaction to that market shift in Ushi's appearance.
It's very hard for me to sort out in my mind to remember what was I thinking at the moment and what am I looking back and reflecting upon as a more mature and experienced adult who spends most of his life trying to give advice to other people to do things lot. And it's hard for me to sort it out. But of course, when I look back, I believe, and Ushi really alluded to this a couple of minutes ago, I'm not making excuses for my expectations and my dreams. I'm not making excuses for how I was tried to rush out of Mitzrayim. But when I look back and I think about how things could have been and how things are, I'm the proudest person in the world, because I do believe that there was something pure that I tried to impart to Ushi. There was a certain pureness, a certain way of looking at the world that, even though through time Ushi would find his own way, nevertheless, there was a perspective of Kedusha, there was a perspective of holiness, and I see that he looks at everything in the world through those eyes. Even though, as I said, the inner pace, even though you might look at somebody who is this successful, worldly business person, Ushi, in a deeper way, is very, very much part of the 1840, that world of 1840. And as Ushi alluded to this before, I don't know if that would have been had we taken that step into the actual culture of Borough Park or Williamsburg or Yerushalayim. I don't know if that would have been. Would Ushi be a person who is deeply honest with himself and whose Yiddishkeit is authentic and that he worked hard for, as opposed to just going along with the flow? So at the time, of course, I was disappointed, because there was something very, at the same time, shallow in me and something very deep in me that was compelling me to have like this, to build this world that I had always expected and wanted, that I wanted to recreate. And of course, Ushi felt that disappointment, and that was hard. It's hard for a kid to feel that. You father and son and father, we loved each other, and we played a lot of ball together. We had a lot of good times and laughs together. But at the end of the day, on that trip home from Stolen, it took a lot of courage for Ushi to tell me that, I can't do this. And it was hard for me, and there's no question that he felt disappointed. But when I think back on that time, I'm the proudest person in the world, and I wouldn't want anything to have happened in a different way. This is exactly the person that Ushi is working on himself to become, and I'm proud of that person. And I would not have been proud anywhere as proud. It might look good in the family pictures to have some kid, next to you in his lavush, and he would have been like he would have been walking around with his gartel. I don't know why some Chassidim wear gartels when they go to get a burger or something, but they seem to do that. But he would have been walking around looking like that. But when I think about how life was and is, it would have been an empty shell of just impersonating somebody that I wanted him to be, and not himself. The person that he is and that he's worked on becoming is the one that I'm proud of, and the one that I believe that Hashem was pulling us both in that direction.
Maybe it's easier, and you'll allow me, it's a different question, but it's a question that relates to both of you about how this journey affected the way that you present vis-a-vis the outside world, and kind of you both are on a fairly public stage, whether it's in Woodmere, whether it's Asher's work in finance and in building organizations and companies. But I'm curious for you, Rebbe, when parents come to you and they're living in the world that you live in now. They live in Woodmere, in the 5 towns, in Bergenfield, and they do have dreams of that holiness to raise their children a certain way. And the parents maybe look one way, but they want to raise a kid with maybe a little bit more of a Chassidic levush and Chassidic minhagim, and to have that. Does your experience with Asher and with Ushi, I call him Asher, affect the advice and the direction that you give them, the decision-making of that process, or it's a totally separate thing? I mean, a couple comes to you and says, we want to do upsharon, and at the upsharon, we want to leave on, the langa peyos and raise our kids, chassidish. We live in Woodmere, we live in Cedarhurst, but this is the world we want to enter our kids in. Do you have, sort of almost like flashbacks or warning signs? What goes on to the advice in that you vis-a-vis the outside world, given your experience that you had raising Asher?
It has a direct, very conscious effect on the advice that I give others. And I try to give others advice. And I'm very open about telling them that I'm trying to help you based upon my own experiences, successes and failures, and good things, mistakes that I've made. I don't know if Ushi remembers, but around the time of his bar mitzvah, I took him to the Divergence Rav, Zechet Tzaddik Kosh Levracha. I don't know if you remember that. I don't know if you know who he was. The Divergence Rav was one of the biggest poskim in the world, a very distant relative of my father, Olav Shalom. And we went to the Divergence Rav. And I asked the Divergence Rav he was an Oberlander, Hungarian, the real old, chassidish Rav, a huge Talmud Chacham and Tzaddik. And I went to the Divergence Rav with Ushi to ask for a bracha. And he said, so auswachsen zu normale Mensch, that may he grow up to be a normal person. So I looked at the Divergence Rav like I had to come here to get a bracha like that. I was hoping, Rav Moshe Feinstein, or to be the chazanish or whatever, Chassam Seifer, something, a normale Mensch. And he saw that I was disappointed, and he said, Kulei hai v'ulai. Those were his words, meaning you'll be very happy if he should be a normal person. Should be a normal person. I think that was one of the greatest bracha that I could have ever heard, and I think that it's colored every exchange that I've had with people when they come to talk to me about Yiddishkeit. But I realized that at the end of the day, if you have a child that is not going to be normal, if you're going to superimpose upon a child an abnormality that is the fulfillment of your expectations and dreams that child is not ready for, nor is he being groomed for in the 5 towns or Bergenfield and so on, then you're not going to have a normal mensch. Thank God Ushi came out to be Bo Hashem. I mean, I don't know if he considers himself to be a normal mensch.
The jury is still out on that one.
No.
The jury's out on that. Okay, because nowadays to be a normal mensch is kula hai v'ulai. But I think that what this whole Indian, raising Ushi and all that we're discussing, I think that it brought me to have a tremendous respect for normale mensch, to be a normal, healthy, emotionally balanced person. I was actually at a bar mitzvah the other night of a Talmud of mine who's a Rebbe in a yeshiva, is a Talmud Chacham, and he's really one of the few that I actually recommended that he move into that world. He was holding by it, and he got married, and he has a chassidish family, and he's living in Borough Park, and they made that move successfully. But to a large extent, when it's very apparent that this is something which is abnormal and not normal, and if that child is going to be able to end up in the world of chassidus, it has to be something that evolves very gradually. I think that my experience with Ushi, that it bears directly upon those conversations, and I'm not ashamed to share that with them, to say that, listen, I've been there and done that. This is not for your kid. Your kid is being raised in Teaneck, or your kid is being raised in the 5 towns. He needs to make certain decisions on his own. You try to impart a sense of Kedusha, try to raise him in a house where he hears about the Kedushas Levi, he hears about Reb Tzadok, or he hears about the Tzaddikim, and you behave in a way that's exemplary to him, and then he'll make a decision on his own when he's older, but don't make him crazy. A normal mensch.
Asher, I'm curious for yourself, there is a component of being in the public eye, and you went on this journey, and aside from the disappointment that you felt at that time that you may have given your father, the shaver crossing the threshold, I'm curious how the kind of role as child of, and you fill in the blank, and being representative of almost the success or the wisdom or the educational depth that your father has, and reflecting poorly, so to speak, on like a family image, on a shul's image. Did that play a role, and how did you figure out a way to go on your own journey when you rightfully could have felt that you were representing so much more?
Ooh. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm still trying to figure it out. I think it's part of it's my life, right? And we all have our own journey, and that's the journey that I'm on. Maybe the muscle here is like, it's kind of like growing up in the house of a famous chef, right? If your father is Wolfgang Puck or something, and you grow up eating, you're not having, scrambled eggs for breakfast, you're having whatever, eggs Benedict, right? So you have a whole different level, a whole different standard that you grew up around, right? Sophistication around theories around food, right? So you might have picked up along the way some really good skills, maybe, you have some senses that are more heightened or more refined, but they're not integrated per se. Right. And then what happens when you got a little older, you go off to yeshiva, and then you're now eating the yeshiva cook's food, the rubbery chicken, or your friend in the dorm is chalent or whatever it is, right? You're never satisfied with what the institutions are offering you, or even what your peers are offering you. You feel somewhat never fully present in your surroundings, right? Never fully in the moment, or like just watching your friends' experience going through yeshiva and so on, being a Talmud to a Rebbe, you always feel somewhat out of the loop. Because you've already been given the highest standard. Again, you haven't integrated it yet, right? But you've been given it, so you know enough to be frustrated, right? And I feel like the experience I had was one where I did feel at odds with my surroundings. Like I never really, in the yeshiva terminology, stelled zu,
connected.
Never really gave myself over to the system because of that, because I'd already seen something completely either at odds in many cases with what I was hearing, or certainly much more sophisticated and felt a lot more aligned with where I was going. So it's a confusing process because, and it doesn't help, especially when you're younger, that could develop into a sense of entitlement or, ego or better than. And for sure, I experienced that with some of my friends where there's a friction, right? Because they were really just going through this gradual incremental process. And I was like trying to unpackage something or to try to find my own place. And I didn't honestly respect necessarily both the institutions and, the ideas that I was being given. So it's complicated. It's very complicated. And there's something you lose. There's something you lose just as not joining a chassidus in Borough Park and being able to stay aloof and to sort of pick and choose. You also lose something. You lose a sense of belonging. You lose a sense of there's a certain anchor that you can, receive from being part of a community, which I know, Dad, I'm sure you've talked about this. You also struggle with, like, just there's a luxury in being able to have big ideas and to pick and choose, but you also lose out on that sense of comfort and stability and being part of something that feels bigger than you. And when you feel bigger than your surroundings, especially as a younger person, that's not very healthy, right? And it doesn't play out well in relationships in other ways. So it's really been a journey to figure out, again, these are big ideas, but are they mine? And to slowly start to unpackage things and to remove certain layers and to stop assuming certain things and then asking myself a lot of questions. And that's the process that I'm still in.
What do you attribute? I'm just curious because, we first met, and you might not remember this, when we were working, I think, on East 13th Street with Birthright alumni. And I remember the person who introduced us, kind of whispered as people do, you should know who his father is, etc., etc. And you moved into the business world where you've had startups. You're involved in this incredibly innovative company called Swimply, which is like an Uber for swimming pools. And I'm curious, where did you draw upon to have the confidence to really chart your own path, where you're no longer kind of in that shadow, even the professional shadow, that I'm going to become a Rav, I'm going to become a Rebbe, a Mechanech, an educator, a Jewish leader in the typical sense, though I very much do consider you a Jewish leader, but in the typical sense, and be able to say, I'm taking another path. I want to become a CEO, an investor, an organization builder. What do you attribute that to?
Also, very interesting question. It's also really interesting that you brought up our first point of contact at the JEC in the West Village, because that really does speak to the broader topic here, which is I always wanted to have one foot in each world. Call it guilt or just a true desire. I would not be satisfied if I was only in the world of business or things that are more mundane. And so I did that. I went for my smicha and I started after hours. I was teaching in the JEC and other places like that. But at some point realized that also didn't feel authentic to me. So remove that layer as well. But I wouldn't say it's over. I wouldn't say that I've given up on my interest in the normative path of Jewish leadership. That's something that I still absolutely think about and potentially will come back to at some point. But I don't feel that what I'm doing now is that different. This may sound a little fantastical, but it's really my worldview very much toward the 1840 idea of like being on this path of evolution, as the Zohar really describes what's going on here. And there are many touch points to that. There is this evolution that is going on in the world of philosophy. There's an evolution going on in general in the business world. Innovation is what interests me, right? I'm somewhat of a futurist. I'm really interested in what's happening now and what's coming next. So I don't see that there's that wide of a bridge between the two worlds. In fact, I'm constantly, at least in my mind, but also in what I'm sharing with people around me, and what drives me is really blending the two. Is like what is actually going on today, and how is what's happening today in the business world really a spiritual evolution? Like I think we're living in incredible times. I talk about this at every single Shabbos table. I mean, this is the type of thing that comes up. This is what I think about all the time. Is like we're living in a time where we have the privilege, the luxury of not having to think about survival per se, at least here in the United States. We don't think about survival or our next meal. So at companies like Google, they're sitting and thinking about artificial intelligence. What does it mean to be a human being? What's the boundary, if there is one, between a human and an animal, between a computer and a human, right? Is there a soul? We're finally starting to ask the questions that truly matter, which is completely reflected as a parallel experience going on in Yiddishkeit, right? We're asking the questions that really matter. And that's what interests me. So I'm going back and forth between these two modes of thinking, and it's not just thinking. In meetings that I have in Silicon Valley, I'm bringing up ideas. We're talking about things that I find to be deeply spiritual. So it's just a matter to me, of circumstance. So right now, the manifestation of that is currently in the business world primarily. But can it change in the coming years? Yeah, totally. There's really it's very fluid for me.
It's fantastic, and we've bonded over these ideas, but you're like the type of futurist, kind of in line with Reb Simcha Banim of Peshischa, who talks about, instead of the descent of each generation, this notion that you can recover the glory of the past, even within the future, and being able to kind of tap into that innovation within each generation is something that's always moved me. It's animated me. It's why we call 1840 what we do. I'm curious, we're releasing this right before Pesach. I know, Rebbe, that they're releasing, they just published a new Haggadah of your Torah that they're publishing now. We'll have links to that. I'm curious if we could get almost a little bit more whimsical, a little bit more memory-based. What was your Seder, your Pesach Seder, like growing up? You have these big drushas, these big public lectures where you're talking to thousands, and then there's something going on in the home. I'm curious if each of you could share what the experience of the Pesach Seder was like growing up, and if there are particular memories about how you created that family culture around your Pesach Seder.
I was determined from the beginning, when it comes to Pesach, I was determined to keep things as simple, and I tried as enjoyable as possible with all of the things that I've adapted and come up with over the years and thinking about. And at the end of the day, I'm my father's son, and my father conducted a very, very straightforward, sweet, and simple Hungarian style Seder, which he received from his parents. Hashem should avenge their blood, which, as you know, the Chassam Sofer himself, that's the Seder that the Chassam Sofer conducted. The Chassam Sofer, all that we have, the thousands of things that we have, all of his Torahs on Pesach, those were not Torahs that he shared with the family at the Seder. Those were Torahs that he wrote and that he said over. It's brought down that he would say later on at night after Shir Hashirim, he would say to a couple of the Talmidim or something. But the Seder itself was, my wife and I tried to keep it straightforward and simple. In the early years, of course, my mother, she shall live and be well, anyway, was hovering over, reminding us every second that your father is hungry. That's also a Hungarian tradition. What are you doing? It's time to move on. But mostly, I think that our Seder was about the kids showing us their projects and telling stories and laughing and having a blast, just having a good time. At least that's what I remember. Keeping it, I was determined to keep them very, very, very simple and sweet.
Asher?
Yeah, totally consistent. Absolutely. That's my experience as well. It was, first of all, very focused around simplicity and very much focused around the kids, still is, and did get that very clear sense of Masorah, of tradition. The thing that stays with me the most is that special nigun, that like the chanting of the Haggadah that comes straight from, my grandfather and from way before that as well. And we felt like we were part of something that was and is a legacy and a tradition. A couple of things that I also recall were, well, Dad used to have your own table for your own matzah. That was always a little, we didn't understand what that was about. Why can't you eat from the rest of our matzah? Turns out we have sticky fingers and gebracht issues. Yeah, a heightened sense of security around the matzah. But I think that might have changed over the years, or at least it's not possible anymore with so many grandkids kind of are around. It's a lost cause. So that was something that stood out. I recall it was just, we would spend hours often after. We didn't have a lot of guests. That was another thing. It wasn't so much about having, and if it was guests, it was family. It wasn't really, or people who were b'nai bayis. It wasn't really outside. It was very comfortable, very cozy. And maybe this is something you'll want to edit out. We're not poskening for anyone here, but I think we did rely probably on the kula of the Chassidic Aish with a little bit of the singing. We felt pretty comfortable, on both sides of the gender aisle singing. But it was family, so I guess it's not exactly the Chassidic Aish's sugya, but
yeah, it's mishpacha.
Yeah, mishpacha, yeah. But I remember even after the lights would go out, after the Seder at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, we would sit, me and my sisters, and they all have, or most of them have great voices. We would sit around and sing for an hour, 2 hours. That's how I remember it. And that was the best part. It was just a sense of there's nowhere else to be. There's nowhere else to go.
I'm curious, you've been through so much together. When you reflect on this journey and you look past, and then we'll follow up with the present, is there anything that you wish you did more of together in those earlier years? And is there anything that you wish you did less of together?
Let's see. I mean, we played a lot of ball, but it was never enough.
Basketball?
Oh, anyways, baseball, basketball, but we play a lot of ball. That's the worst part of this whole thing, at least from my perspective, is, it's one thing to have a father who's a Talmud Chacham and a Rav and all that, and it's like, okay, so he's a better Jew and he's better in learning than you, but the fact that your father's also a better ball player that was always that was hard.
Is that true?
Yeah,
that was hard. Yeah, and I'm 6'3", and
yeah.
It was a little embarrassing, honestly, and that I think is the hardest part of this whole thing for me, getting over that one. But things we don't do anymore is we don't wrestle anymore. We used to have a minhag after Shabbos morning, which is not ideal. You don't want to have a wrestling match right after Cholent, but we did. That was our minhag. We don't do that anymore after I think I caused maybe a permanent injury. But that's pretty much over and done with. But we spent a lot of time learning together. We had a lot of chavurusas. I was actually pulled out of yeshiva pretty early. Like, I had other chavurusas, and we had a very good system. I think I remember that we had like actual tests. I think sometimes there were like these amazing prizes. Like, I would have like very generous. I was the only son. There was no competition here, so very generous prizes and rewards. So to make the learning fun. But yeah, that's how I remember it.
Rebbe, is there anything you want to add?
I think that those times were very normal. I always lived then and now under the terrible constraints of time, because I'm pulled in so many directions by so many people, and I live constantly with the guilt in the present, more with my grandchildren now, and thoughts of the past. How I just would have loved taking more trips, like just driving up to Bear Mountain and hiking, like things that a lot of regular chevra do that I just didn't have the luxury to do. And I feel bad that I didn't prioritize as I should have. Looking back, I should have given more time to Ushi and the kids on the cheshbon of other people. But, at the time, I thought that I was saving the world, not consciously, but I was doing my best to save that world that Hashem put in my lap. And at times I felt that I wasn't paying enough attention to the world that was in my own home. And I have regrets about that, but I try not to get stuck in those thoughts. There's no point to them. I tried my best. That's all. And with all my limitations, I tried. That's all.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah.
Briefly? I think it's cliche that everyone on their deathbed, regrets not spending, more time on things that matter more. But that wasn't my experience, and I think I could speak on behalf of my sisters too. I don't think that was their experience either. First of all, we did think that you were saving the world. And you probably were, number one. Number two is I for sure felt like I didn't expect it. It's like I didn't need to go hiking on Bear Mountain. Having a couch on the front lawn was more than enough. But I think that again, speaking for the rest of the family, we felt like partners in this. Like it mattered to us, the work that you were doing, even if it wasn't work, it was just sitting and learning. It mattered to us, and we felt and still feel like partners in that. So it didn't feel like we were missing out on anything. Honestly, I don't look back at all and think that there was more time that could have been spent, and we didn't go on enough fishing trips. Doesn't feel like any sort of lack at all. So just if it makes you feel better.
I wish you'd have told that to me a long time ago, because I've been tormenting myself over that. That's why I said to Reb David before we went on air. I said that I said this is cheaper than therapy. So I've been tormenting myself about that all of the years. And your mother, she should be well. She always says to me, don't make yourself crazy. And she always felt that was true, that the children felt that there was a partnership. But I've always regretted that. That comes also with the post-Holocaust and Hungarian upbringing, that guilt. And I appreciate you sharing this with me now.
Yeah.
Here's my final question is really about the present. I think one of the big challenges of our generation is being a parent to adult children. And I'm curious to talk now about just what do you bond over together with now? You're at different stages in your life, and I'm almost more curious, is there anything that you deliberately do not do together and don't bond over together and deliberately create space for one another?
So let me take this one. I'll be very brief.
Sure.
One of those transitions that takes place, it's usually later than, thank God I'm not 90 years old in a retirement home, but I'm aging, Baruch Hashem. And one of those things that happens with age is that things sort of become reversed. I have found that one of the things that is most gratifying to me, and I'm not ashamed to say this, I'm proud, is that I really turn to Ushi for a lot of advice. That's what's been changing over the past few years. There are things that I go through in my position that are sometimes hurtful and challenging. And I don't really, my Rebbe, I should have a Rebbe now, but my Rebbe is no longer in the world of the living. And my Rebbeim are no longer here, they're long gone. And one of the things that I find most gratifying is that I'm able to turn to my son. And I trust his insight. I trust his wisdom. And I find that it makes me feel incredibly close to him. First of all, he's always looking out for me. And I respect his advice. I respect his insight. I respect what he brings to the table. I don't really talk to too many people. People come to ask me for advice, and I find that I'm turning more and more to my own son for advice. And I feel that that's something that draws me very, very close. Not just because I don't consider myself a needy person, but I'm so grateful to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that I have a son like this, that I could now turn to him and speak to him and hear what he has to say. I'm amazed with the chidushim that he has, and both in his thinking of Torah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his thoughts about the world. And I'm, in a certain way, I've become a bit of a Talmud, and I'm very proud of that. And I feel that it creates a tremendous bond between us. I'm not able to have the catch on the lawn anymore. Maybe I should try. Last time I played ball with the shul, I still have a limp from that last experience, Memorial Day or Lag Baimer, I don't know, like 10 years ago. So I don't know if I could throw the ball around, but we throw ideas around and we have a catch. Not on the front lawn, but over the table and in my study. And there's nothing that's more precious to me, more dear to me than those conversations.
Asher?
Yeah. Well, I had a feeling that this conversation would be cathartic in many ways. And hearing that it doesn't get better, but it's also exactly how I feel. On my side of the equation is I feel like our individual journeys as separate people, are starting to merge in a new way. Like there was a natural process of me having to individuate. Every parent and child has to go through that. And now it's sort of, as I'm growing, the paths are starting to merge. It's unbelievably, firstly, gratifying. I sense that too. I sense that I have something to bring to the table when most of my life, it was the other way around. And just having gone out there in the world and picked up a few things and developed into maybe more of a self-standing individual, allows me to finally have my own unique perspective. So I think that it feels incredibly gratifying that's seen, that's visible on the other side of the table. And also, like, we work together a lot, and a lot of it's behind the scenes as it should remain. But I think part of being a Rav of a very quickly expanding, I guess, call it Kehillah. It's not really the best way to describe it. There's certain other characteristics, there's certain other skill sets that are needed for that maybe not, if I may, are not so natural or intuitive, like certain executive skills, right? Management, organization, and things like that. So just being able to help on more of the quote unquote business side of this and to help my father really fill in some of those gaps to make the work that he's doing more seamless and to and to help to accomplish some of those big ideas that sometimes require a different set of eyes and a different set of hands. So just being able to help and be part of that process is something that for me is incredibly meaningful, because it aligns our purposes that I've always really been aligned. It's just a matter of what's the approach we're taking to get to the same end result. So now I feel like they're starting to come together, and I'm really curious about and excited to see how it develops in the coming, hopefully, decades. So yeah, it does feel like a journey coming full circle.
It is an incredible privilege to be in whatever small way at the nexus, to speak to two people who have had such a tremendous influence on me, and the fact that even through differences, however subtle they were, to see that kind of return and that synthesis of a parent and child, I think is really inspiring, certainly to myself. I have no doubt to our listeners, and it's really been a privilege to be able to speak to both of you today, and I remain so grateful.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. There was no one else that we would have had this conversation with, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Doug.
Okay, Rebbe, you're putter. I can't thank you enough for this, but really thank you so.
Like she says, cathartic. I thank you. We both thank you. Okay, David, I'll speak to you. Okay, see you later.
All right, Dad. See you later, Dad.
Okay, we'll be B'Kesher, Rebbe. I always ask my guests 3 questions at the very end of the interview. I did them once already with your father, but I'm curious for you, is there a book, idea, article that you would recommend that gave you the strength to, the word you use is individuate. Give me a book, an article that really anchored your strength to kind of create this path for yourself.
If we're talking Yiddishkeit, so it's Roy Nachman, no question, it's where I found it. It was the first place that I found someone who I felt understood me, but also hadn't really been touched by any preconceived notions. Meaning, this is actually really important to the conversation we just had, is my father, he learned everything with me. I had either himself directly or I had tutors, teaching me Tanya or whatever it was at 7 years old. The one thing we never really learned together was Rabbi Nachman. I grew up around the stories.
Do you think that was deliberate?
So I didn't know. But years later, when I was starting to grow up, I was already in my early 20s, and I discovered it, so to speak. And I went I went all in. And I asked him this question, like almost desperately once. He picked up from the airport one time, and I'm like, Dad, I didn't say hello. And I was like, Dad, why don't you teach me Likutei Moharan? And he was quiet, and he said to me, I figured if there's the one thing I wouldn't ruin for you. That's what he said.
Wow.
And I understood that. I understood what he was trying to tell me. Not that he ruined other things for me per se, but
no, I understand.
Yeah, but aside for it being
to come to it on your own,
come to it on my own, yeah. But also specifically Rabbi Nachman, because there's, as you know, there's a lot there, especially for people looking for healing. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. If somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to retire without any responsibilities, take a sabbatical, and go back to school to get a PhD, what do you think the topic and title of that PhD would be?
Oh, can I answer it a little bit differently?
Absolutely.
This actually is one of my plans. My parents are both Ivy Leaguers, so even though that wasn't the plan for me, I think there's still someone a little disappointed that I didn't do that. So I think it's still in the cards for me. I'll answer it in a different way, and it's really about the kind of book I like to write, which you can call it a thesis. So a book that really got me going is pretty well-known book by Yuval Noah Harari called *Sapiens: Brief History of, I think, Mankind* or something like that. And I found that the way he sort of pulled together and organized a brief, history of evolution from a scientific and definitely non-believing perspective was unbelievable. So what I'd like to do is to write a book from the perspective of Emunah on spiritual evolution, on 1840, right? To sort of give a history of mankind. I would call the book, instead of Sapiens, I would call it Adam, a spiritual evolution or something like that. And that's the thing I'm interested in. I'm interested very much in how do the worlds of innovation, secular innovation, and spiritual innovation collide.
That is absolutely fascinating, and I hope when the time comes to write that book, we spend another time, in an office really working it out, as we did so many years ago. My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you usually go to sleep, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
I'm not a very good sleeper. I go to bed probably around 1:30 ballpark. I'm up more or less every hour and a half. I don't necessarily get out of my room until 7:30, but I'm usually, I work in multiple time zones. So I work on West Coast, Israel, Australia, and East Coast simultaneously. So yeah, it's right now. It's not a question you want to ask me. I don't want to give people my lifestyle. It's not the way to live.
Not recommended.
No.
Asher, I cannot thank you enough. You're a dear friend, and just your honesty, authenticity, vulnerability that you bring to everything that you do, but particularly our conversation today means a great deal to me. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me.
The friendships that I find most satisfying are the ones that have evolved with me since childhood, and I am extraordinarily blessed that I have such friendships. People that I've known, Yoni, Akiva, another Yoni. I have certain friends that have stayed with me since I am a child, since as early as I can remember, and I remain in touch with today. Not everybody has that privilege, but there's something quite beautiful about it, and I think what is so marvelous about it is that you can look back, at least I can look back at those periods of those small differences that allowed for friction in a friendship, in a relationship, that necessarily emerge and kind of feel like we're living in two separate worlds. And then the work that you do to kind of ensure that that underlying relationship, that underlying friendship remains together, remains tethered to something real and something whole. And I think what's so powerful in our religious lives, and why so much of the language when we talk about our relationship to God, is we really almost always use language of parents and children. And the reason why I think that's so is because in our relationship to God, we do evolve and we do have to confront the differences, big and small, intergenerational differences, lifnei avinu shebashamayim, those intergenerational differences between our Father in heaven, so to speak, that sometimes are quite big and sometimes are quite headlining and sometimes are quite small and almost imperceptible. But even those smaller differences, like the ones that we discussed today, can be real, can require conversation, can require thoughtfulness and navigation, which is why it was such an absolute privilege to have this conversation with Rav Moshe Weinberger and Asher. This is the last episode in the series before Pesach. We do have one more episode afterwards. But I wanted to leave you with an idea that I saw my dear friend Rabbi Natan Farber shared. He shares this, I think, almost every year on Twitter. I think it's so beautiful. Natan Farber on Twitter is at Natan Farber, Natan Farber, at Natan Farber. He's a Rebbe in DRS. I know him for many, many years. He's one of the great creative educational geniuses we have in our community. And he always shares an idea around the Pesach Seder that, to me, is very central to everything that we've been discussing. Right before we tell the story of the four children at the Pesach Seder, the Arba Banim, the four sons, the wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, and the one who does not know how to ask, the highlight of every Haggadah is looking at how those children are depicted. I have an old column in Mashpia magazine I always get a kick out of the way different Haggadahs depict the wicked son. They're always, it tells a lot about the author or the illustrator by how they depict them, but that's for a different time. But the introduction to the four children, we say the following prayer, the following very brief words. We say, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. We refer to God, blessed are you God, but we refer to God specifically as HaMakom, as the place. And it's a strange way. We've rarely referred to God as HaMakom, as the place. Why specifically in our introduction to the Arba Banim, to the four sons in the Haggadah, do we use this terminology? And Rabbi Farber shared a beautiful idea from Rabbi Soloveitchik that is cited in the work Harare Kedem, where he writes as follows, that we invoke the name Hamakom, specifically Hamakom meaning the place, in moments where we need to be reminded that God is ultimately everywhere in our lives. We invoke this name Hamakom, of the place, kind of this notion that God is our very foundation, our very bedrock, our very context, during moments when we need this reminder, when we need the reminder that God is in fact our Makom, that God is in fact our place. Moments that we might be bereft, most famously during times of loss, when we wish people who are in mourning, Hamakom Yenachem Eschem, may God, but referred to as Hamakom, the place, comfort you. It is the reminder that even when God is obscured and is not apparent, he can still be found. He's still the bedrock of your identity. And we use the word Hamakom before Arba Banim for this part of the Haggadah to remind us that God is for everyone. That ultimately, just like God is everywhere, and we remind ourselves during times of loss that God is still accessible, God can still be found. We remind ourselves before we talk about divergence within a family, wicked children, wise children, children who don't know how to ask, simple children. we invoke the term hamakom again. Because when you look at your children, it's very easy for a moment to feel like, I wish God was more accessible, could be found more in all of my kids. This one, God can't really be found. But we specifically invoke the word hamakom as that reminder that God is for everyone and can be found in everyone. That even perhaps, and parenting can be so difficult, being a child can be so difficult. I wish there was a verb. We have a verb for being a parent called parenting. We don't have a great verb for being a child. And that can also be really hard. Childing, whatever you want to call it. That relationship that is at the center of our lives that we build from one generation to the next can be really challenging in ways both big and small. And in the Haggadah, as we approach this recognition of the diversity within families, we send that reminder for ourselves, invoking the very same term that we use when we comfort those in mourning, that reminder that God can still be found. Even though he may feel obscured, maybe he's being manifest, maybe godliness is being manifest in a way that we're not as familiar with. But the same way that God can be found in moments of loss, God can be found within all of our children, within all different forms of relationships, and Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, God can ultimately be found in all of us. So thank you so much for listening. This episode, like so many of our episodes, was edited by our friend Dina Emerson. And thank you once again to our sponsors, Evan Goldenberg, who is the sponsor of this episode, and our friend Danny Turkel, who sponsored the series. It wouldn't be a Jewish podcast without a little bit of Jewish guilt. So if you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. That's 18forty.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or options that we may play on a future episode. That number is 917-720-5629. Once again, that number to leave a voice note is 917-720-5629. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word forty.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.